Israel Update with Gadi Taub and Mike Duran. Hello, this is Israel Update. It's been 319 days to this war. I'm Gadi Taub in Tel Aviv, and Mike Duran is once again in an undisclosed location. Hello, Mike.
Hello, Gadi. I'm in an undisclosed location, but one that's very secure.
Your locations are looking more and more undisclosable. I have to tell you. So before we start, it's been a busy week in the news in Israel, as if there is any week that is not busy in the news in Israel. You know, it's not New Zealand. Every news outlet in Israel is never out of work, except, Mike, you know, one. There's one outlet that is always boring. And this is the guy who consistently every morning has a weather line for surfers. We never have waves in Israel. And if you're a surfer and you call this guy in the morning, it's like, there's no wind today. The surf is 60 centimeters. It'll be a boring afternoon. And on and on. It's humorous.
I used to know a guy who worked for the telephone company, and he had the night shift, and he was there in case of a major emergency. That was his only duty. So he basically had nothing to do except sit around and watch movies all night long. But he did have the what do you call it? Private numbers, you know, the unlisted numbers of all of the celebrities in America.
So he would call them and play hoaxes.
If you wanted, I could, you know, back then, if you wanted Jennifer Aniston's phone number, I could have got it for you.
Ah, shucks, I missed that opportunity.
Yeah.
We have to. There are a couple of things we need to mention from last time's episode. One of them is that we both committed to predictions about whether or not a war would start, and we would check these against the harsh facts of the news. And another thing is that I made a major mistake, Mike, and I quoted the brilliant observation by Irit Linur, who said that the way to tell left from right is Israel is by asking, who do you fear more, Arabs or Jews? And I said that if you say you fear Jews, then you are on the right. And that's, of course, the other way around. If you say you fear Jews, you're on the left. If you say you fear Arabs more than Jews, then you are on the right. So there you go. The mistake is corrected. And now I think we're all ready.
Excuse me, I don't really want to talk about the predictions because my prediction was wrong.
So we'll skip that. Don't worry.
I make it a policy to erase all wrong predictions so that my track record is perfect.
However, we have it on tape, so we are going to force you. But now
we'll have to delete it.
Now let's hear what the news is.
Okay. Well, Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been in Israel, and he said yesterday that Prime Minister Netanyahu had confirmed in their meeting that he accepts an American bridging proposal meant to close the gaps between the Hamas and Israeli positions on the ceasefire negotiations. So the decision, Gadi, is now in Hamas's hands, and Blinken said as much in a press statement following the meeting. He said, quote, with every passing day, two things can happen. One is, of course, more hostages can perish. And second, intervening events come along that may make things even more difficult, if not impossible, unquote. Prime Minister Netanyahu described his meeting with Secretary Blinken as good and important, and he thanked the Biden administration for its support for Israel. Netanyahu said, quote, I greatly appreciate the efforts that the U.S. is making in regional defense against the Iranian axis. This is important, of course, for the state of Israel. I also greatly appreciate the understanding that the United States has shown for our vital security interests as part of our efforts to bring about the release of our hostages. I would like to emphasize the efforts to release a maximum number of living hostages already in the first stage of the deal. Israeli sources told the Israeli media that a round of negotiations that was scheduled to be held tomorrow in Cairo is now expected to be postponed until the end of the week due to lack of progress in the talks. The sources said that the meeting might not take place at all. Generally, confidence that a deal will soon emerge is waning. Minister of Security, well, that's you call him, Gadi, Minister of Security. I like to call him Minister of Defense, but
the actual Hebrew is bitachon.
Yeah, the literal translation is Minister of Security. Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, has been briefing journalists off the record, saying in direct contradiction to Netanyahu's position that there is no need to insist on an Israeli military presence in the Philadelphia corridor. That, of course, is the corridor, the border between Gaza and Egypt, the southern border. The briefings of Gallant have been leaked and are widely reported in the Israeli press. In contrast to Gallant, IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi has been saying, in parallel with Gallant, pardon me, IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi has been saying more or less the same thing. Sources in Israeli...
But on the record, that's the contrast. He said it. He says it on the record. He said it to journalists.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
I didn't see that. Sources in the Israeli delegation to Cairo have been leaking to journalists a complaint that as negotiators, they have not been given enough room to maneuver regarding the Philadelphia corridor. In other words, Netanyahu hasn't allowed them to accept Hamas's position. Prime Minister Netanyahu nevertheless insists that there can be no withdrawal from the corridor, and it now seems that the Biden administration has moved in his direction, which is a very interesting development that you and I are going to have to talk about. Finally, an attempted terror attack took place in Tel Aviv on Sunday. A terrorist from the Nablus area was carrying an 8-kilogram bomb made of explosives. The investigators believe it was accidentally detonated when the terrorist tried to arm it ahead of its use. Back to you, Mr. Taub. Dr. Taub, forgive me.
Yeah. Let's start with the Philadelphia corridor, Mike, because this is a major controversy here and also a major rift between those who are considered close to the United States and by proxy more willing to accommodate Hamas and Netanyahu. And we see this happening. We've been discussing this on our podcast repeatedly. There's always a faction within the government that is angling towards the American position, which is, as I said, leaning towards Hamas. And we saw Eisenkot and Gallant and Gantz try to do it from within the cabinet. They then threatened and then left the cabinet in protest because the Netanyahu government was not willing to accommodate these views. And now Gallant, Minister of Security, has assumed the same position. He was probably on the same page with them when they were in the government, but they are now deliberately leaking this to the press in the midst of negotiations. This is not something marginal. You have a minister of security who is undermining the Israeli position by also hinting to Hamas that there are people in the government who are willing to entertain their views. And Hamas, being knowledgeable about Israeli politics, that as they are, have now put out statements saying that what is now holding back the deal is Netanyahu's recalcitrance. Sorry, am I pronouncing that right?
Yes. The second time
so they're playing into the game in Israel and basically supporting the Kaplan left, because as you see, and you mentioned this on the news, Secretary Blinken directly blamed Hamas. He said Israel has accepted the bridging offer that the United States made, and now Hamas should do too. And then the whole chorus in the Israeli press immediately is Netanyahu is putting stumbling blocks in the way of the deal. And your favorite Israeli journalist Ben Caspit has audaciously put on his Telegram channel a picture of the 6 returned bodies of murdered hostages with a candle saying Yizkor. Remember, this is the official Israeli symbol of mourning, a candle with Yizkor. and under it, ata harosh, ata Hashem, directly blaming Netanyahu for their death.
You're in charge. You're guilty.
Yeah. So the press in Israel and Hezbollah are trying to say that the reason the hostages are not back is Netanyahu, and some saying that the reason that some hostages are dead is Netanyahu's fault. However, the public is I don't think is buying that line at all.
Well, the really interesting thing to me here is the shift in the American position, because you and I have been saying all along that the Americans are aligning or the Biden administration is consciously aligning with the Gallant, with Gantz, with Eisenkot, with the security establishment, and they're doing that in order to bring down the government or certainly weaken Netanyahu. And yet here at this moment we've had the whole buildup to all of the negotiations in Doha was on the Israeli side, were people from the security establishment leaking to the press that Netanyahu isn't giving them enough flexibility, and that he's ruining relations with the United States, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then Blinken comes in and says Netanyahu is doing a good job. So either our analysis was wrong all the time, which of course it is not, Gadi, or there's been a shift for some reason in the American position. I got a few thoughts about that, but I won't say that I have a great handle on it. What do you think?
Well, it's strange and it's surprising, and my one guess is that they are trying to offset some of the damage caused by the tilt towards the squad in the Democratic Party, and especially now in the convention. I think what's happening in Chicago is actually amazing. We should be following it as it unfolds, or talking about it in our next show, because my feeling is that the pressure on the Harris-Walz ticket to further align with the Hamas supporters, basically, in their party, is the protest in the street, which is making that very present. And I've just learned from Caroline Glick that in Chicago, Jewish events, whether APAC or J Street or otherwise, are not announced for fear of violence, and people have to register and then have their identity and social media checked to know that they're not agents provocateurs.
You mean you're talking about just normal Jewish events in Chicago on a regular basis, or Jewish events around the convention?
Around the convention, I think, is what Caroline Glick talked about. So in this scenario, there might be people within the administration saying, are we not going too far in terms of disregarding the Jewish vote? We will, I think, discuss later. We will go back to Ilan Goldenberg, I think, later on in the show. So maybe Blinken is trying to perform some damage control by standing behind or supporting Netanyahu's position. And I have it from sources in Israel, which I trust. They think that America will now grudgingly support or not apply further pressure on evacuating the Philadelphia corridor, having learned that there is no way that Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to give that up.
Yeah, that was my thought. I had two thoughts about this. Let's just assume that this is a foreign policy decision, made for purely on foreign policy grounds, and not on and not with domestic political thoughts in mind. In that case, they may have realized that their chances now of toppling Netanyahu in the short term before the election are about nil. When they had Chuck Schumer call for Netanyahu to step down and hold new elections, I think they really thought they were going to be able to bring him down. We analyzed here. We believe that Gantz and Eisenkot was their departure from the government was the prelude to a really big push to try to bring about a change of government. But unless they can get a ceasefire agreement They're not going to. There'll be no credible call inside Israel for a new government, and they're not. The party that is not helping the Americans here is Hamas. I mean, the Netanyahu accepted the bridging proposal, came toward them. They can't deny that he's done that. It's just it's a matter of fact. While Hamas is saying that the proposal is unacceptable, they haven't said they haven't outright rejected it, but they have openly criticized it. So I just think maybe they're bowing. Well, one other possibility here. I'm not disagreeing with what you said about the domestic play, but one other possibility is that they're just bowing to reality.
Yeah, it's interesting what the alignment is here, because the Israeli press, the anti-Netanyahu demonstrators, and Hamas have all been trying to blame Netanyahu, and now the centerpiece, which is, and that's not the first time. We need to remember also that in Biden's speech, when he announced the deal, he said also that Netanyahu went as far as he could go in attempting to secure a deal. So obviously, they're trying to paint a picture of Netanyahu as the stumbling block to the deal. And in a sense, that's a valid way to look at it, because Netanyahu is not willing to give up Israel's most vital interests, which is what Hamas is demanding. So there is a fit, or a close fit, between the Hamas position and the anti-Netanyahu protesters and the Israeli press. Immediately, the press is full, Mike. The press is full with quotes from security authorities saying the Philadelphia corridor is not that necessary, and saying Netanyahu, this is the bomb that Netanyahu planted in order to sabotage the deal. But what the Israeli public is reading, which to judge by the growing support for Netanyahu, is that good for us that Netanyahu is not willing to give Israel's most vital interest. And that is exactly why Hamas is angry, because the demand is that we would give up all that we have fought for in this war, and also give up victory. And Netanyahu has been consistent, and I think wisely so, from the very beginning of this war. He has, and I've said this often on this show, he has been playing one single note: total victory. And behind he would love to have the hostages back, and he would go far, in my opinion, too far, in order to secure that deal. I don't think we should reward terrorists for kidnapping and for abducting people, because if we have done great damage from the Gilad Shalit deal, from Sharon, from the Jibril deal, of teaching our enemies that for a single Israeli soldier, we would release hundreds of terrorists from our jails. And we just taught them that this is an effective means. But this is a whole new ball game. If we now teach them that Israel would surrender in a war if you hold our hostages, no sane country can allow itself to do this. And the anti-Netanyahu faction, or the anti-Netanyahu movement in Israel, has been, for them, removing Netanyahu at all cost is the single obsession. And they've used the hostage deal in order to blame Netanyahu for not wanting to return the hostages. And so they framed everything in this way, in which we should give up all that we fought for in this war, because there's one overarching moral obligation, and this is Pidyon Shvuim. It's a deeply Jewish tradition that you return your abducted brethren from their captivity. So now they're supporting a deal which is obviously also a death sentence to anyone who is not released in the first stage. And so the rhetoric of these same people has shifted towards a deal because this is what will prevent a regional war. And Mike, you are the master of escalation dominance. You do not achieve escalation dominance by saying that you want to avoid a war at all cost. So this is deranged. And I've been writing about this. They've been saying this. Our real war, they say, is not against Hamas. It's against Netanyahu. Hamas we can deal with. The enemy from within, that is the real danger. And they have completely lost any ability to think in strategic terms and are willing to just strip Israel of all its strategic assets.
I think the position among the security and military people for leaving the Philadelphia corridor is really weak. I think it's weak on personally on security terms. But it's also got to be, and I'm going to look for you to validate what I'm about to say, that it's weak on political terms in Israel in the following sense. I saw a quote this week by Herzi Halevi saying that it's no problem leaving the corridor because we can always go back in. But this is what every Israeli, this sentence, we can always go back in, we know what to do. That's what Ehud Barak said when he got out of Lebanon in 2000. It's what Sharon said when he withdrew from Gaza in 2005. It's what they've said at the end of every round of fighting with Hamas and Gaza since then, when they have stopped the war short of victory. By now, and this is where I need you to validate, I'm sure that when they hear that sentence, we can always go back in and take care of business. We know what to do. Trust us. The Israeli public must just say, "Hold on a second. I've heard this a million times before, and it didn't work." Am I wrong? I mean, there has to be.
No, I think you're right. I think the anti-Netanyahu crowd their brains have been mashed with a schnitzel hammer. Is that a term in English? Patish schnitzelim?
No.
So I'll use another one.
But everyone understands just softening up the meat, for tenderizing the meat with a hammer.
Yeah. They've turned their political vocabulary into soft puree because the press has been hammering narratives that are increasingly harder to square with reality. So the anti-Netanyahu crowd is going to buy anything, like they bought, when the talks of the hostage deal, they actually bought the narrative, and you see journalists in droves repeating it, that the right-wingers are evil-hearted and they don't care about the hostages. That was the line that they were trying to sell about people, about people like the settlers who are sacrificing their lives in Gaza more than anyone else. So these people are lost, and they're about a third of the population. They're fanatics, and there's no way to penetrate their worldview. But in the center, I'm sure what you are saying is right. And what I have in support of that opinion is the fact that Netanyahu's poll numbers are rising. They are rising, and people are not buying this. And on the background and when you look at what Herzi Halevi is actually saying, I dug up this week. You will enjoy this, I think. Herzi Halevi was Mefaked Aluf Pikud Darom. He was the commander of the Southern Theater, which is the Gaza Theater and the Egyptian Theater, a few years back. And he wrote an analysis called Hagana Rav Memadit, multi-layered protection, in which he boasted with our amazing technology and how Hamas could never penetrate it.
That's the argument for leaving the Philadelphia corridor.
Exactly. They say we'll have sensors and the slurry wall. And the slurry wall.
By the way, in their defense,
two more facts.
Go ahead.
One thing is that 200 tunnels have been discovered so far in the Philadelphia corridor. I spoke to Amit Halevi, member of Knesset from Likud, who sits on the Security and Foreign Affairs Committee. He said we are finding 5 tunnels every day in the Philadelphia corridor. And there comes Herzi Halevi and said we'll have an underground obstacle. Because he said, the Hamas didn't penetrate Israel from underground. Our underground barrier is very effective. And on top of the ground, we'll have sensors. And people are saying, so you have sensors, you again trust the Egyptians. And if your sensors discover something, what? You will start a new ground invasion of Gaza? It has been so hard to do this against international resistance and against many in the Israeli public, and you will think you will be able to go back there again. So just to support your point, Mike, both Ariel Sharon and Ehud Barak as prime ministers, when Sharon left Gaza and Barak left Lebanon, says the first rocket they shoot at us, the first one, will go there in full force. And then a rocket is shot, and you can't use full force for one rocket. And then two rockets. They don't start a war immediately. They work by eroding your red lines.
You remember when General Goffman, I can't think of his first name.
Alex Goffman, I think.
No, it's not Alex. Anyway, he's the
he's a Russian guy.
Roman, right?
Goffman. You're right.
Yeah. He's now the military advisor to Netanyahu, and he appeared. You sent me this clip. This is months and months and months ago. It was a farewell ceremony for Eisenkot when he was stepping down as chief of staff, and Goffman stood up and spoke in front of the entire top echelon of, and I'm talking about hundreds of officers of the IDF, and he said very bravely, Goffman is an armored commander, and he said something very very bad has a very damaging pattern has emerged where we get attacked and we don't respond. And he said, we in the armored corps, we're ready to fight. We want to fight, and you should put us in, because one of the most important ways that you gain training as a military officer is actually by fighting, but also this is one of the major ways that you get information about the enemy is by having friction with the enemy. And he said, if there's no friction with the enemy, that leads to clinical death of the military. All right, so these are actually prophetic statements that he made. But
they sat there laughing at him. That was amazing.
They laughed at it, but I went and this clip came from a documentary about Eisenkot, and I went and I dug up the larger exchange, because Eisenkot then took I don't know if you ever saw this. He took the stage and responded. He responded and he said exactly what you just said. But he explained the logic. He said, I know you're ready to fight. It is important to have friction with the enemy. I can't remember if he said that exactly, but he made a kind of a few statements in the direction of Goffman. And then he said, but we can't start a war just because they sent a few rockets. So in other words, we have to rely on our passive defenses, and we have to just sit back and take this. And of course, what happened is clinical death. In the end, it didn't work.
And we're having the same problem in the north now with the failed decision by the Security Council 1701 at the end of the Second Lebanon War, which promised us that Hezbollah would be dismantled and so on and so forth. And that was supposed to be backed up by the international community, the Security Council, and everyone else. And of course, when this began, when the erosion of this Security Council resolution by Hezbollah in the north, nothing happened. It didn't trigger the international community to action, and Israel also learned to grit its teeth. And we have been containing Hezbollah, and they've figured us out, Mike. They figured us out. Yeah. They know what the amounts that they know how bold they can be without triggering a war. They know how far they can go, and they can go pretty far if they do it gradually. Because naturally, with human beings, borders and limits and red lines are eroded if you do this incrementally. If you try to
have
breach...
the harsh reality is that if you're not willing to escalate, because this is the dogma of the Biden administration, de-escalation, de-escalation, de-escalate, don't escalate. But if you're not willing to escalate, then you are inevitably allowing your enemy to win. There's just this, it's absolutely
it's science.
It's the science is settled on this. People don't like to think this way because but it's necessary. By the way, Netanyahu said this week with regard to the Philadelphia corridor that one of the reasons we can't give up on it is that it will send the wrong signal to the Iranians at this moment. It will send a signal of weakness, which they will exploit. And I think in my mind, this is absolutely the right argument.
And so explain this a little more. The Iranians would see this and they would consider this as a defeat for Israel in the war against Hamas, and then?
Well, so Iran has put all of the elements of its resistance axis behind the global ceasefire movement. That's what it's saying. And the American thesis, which is a response to the Iranian pressure on the United States and on Israel, is ceasefire now. The American thesis is that a ceasefire in Gaza will lead to a ceasefire in Lebanon, will lead to a ceasefire by the Houthis, and will lead to de-escalation by the Iranians. But ceasefire now, what the Americans actually want, and they made it pretty clear, sometimes explicitly, they want not just a 42-day ceasefire, but they want a permanent ceasefire, which means Hamas remains in power in Gaza. And that ultimately is what Iran wants. Iran wants to mobilize American power to put pressure on Israel to keep Hamas alive. And Netanyahu is fighting the good fight against that. And holding the Philadelphia corridor is both one of the ways that because if you don't hold the Philadelphia corridor, you don't have control of the economic economic lifelines of the Gaza Strip. And if you don't have control of those, then you hand them over to Hamas, and you'll never destroy Hamas as a governing institution in Gaza. The Americans don't want to do that. The Americans are willing to leave Hamas there. They think that there's no way to actually defeat Hamas. And that this whole notion of total victory is silly in that regard. And I guess Gallant has accepted their thesis, and he also, because he said before the Security and Defense Committee, or the Foreign and Defense Committee, I'm sorry, Foreign and Security Committee for you, Gadi, of the Knesset, that the idea of total victory is a fable. I can't remember what phrase he said, but he said it's
he said nonsense.
So it's nonsense. The idea being that basically what we have to do is just prevent Hamas from constituting a military threat to our population. We can't really get involved in who's controlling it on the ground. I assume that's how he's thinking. But personally, I think that the Israelis, if they ever want reliable security in this age of missiles and rockets and drones and everything, then they actually have to change the governance in Gaza. And you can't do that unless you control the economic lifeline.
Oh, I'd say more than that. I had as I said, an interesting conversation with on my Hebrew podcast with a member of Knesset, Amit Halevi, from the Security and Foreign Affairs Committee of the Knesset. And he said, our terms are completely wrong. The idea that we are separating Hamas from the population is wrong. The idea that we are separating Hamas from clerics is wrong. Because he said, if you look at the numbers, you take the people who are registered card-carrying members of the Hamas movement, and you add the people who work for Hamas in civil administration, and you add the number of people who are actual fighters of Hamas, or otherwise employed by Hamas in any other way. And then you subtract all the overlapping of these groups, what you get is more or less the number of households in Gaza. So that in every apartment you find weapons. It's all over there. And he said, if you separate in your Western mind, you separate Hamas fighters from an imam in a mosque who is calling for people to actually extract the inner organs of Jews and eat them, then you are not dealing with a real problem. Israel should forbid the books by which they teach children from kindergarten that killing Jews and eating their internal organs is a religious virtue, and you should also arrest every imam who is spewing Nazi propaganda. So the level of control that you need in order to do all that is not just to defeat the actual combatants. You need to take full control of the civil administration of Gaza for an extended period of time if you want to do this. I know now that you saw my interview with the Wall Street Journal, in which they interviewed me at length about what my solution for the long term is. And in the end, I just said one word: occupation. So that's not the long-term meaning forever, but it means enough time so we can actually change the way this society is governed, educated, and the way children are brought up. Or otherwise, you would have people willing to die if they can take some Jews with them in the foreseeable future, because that is the religious teaching and the education that they are brought up on. And I'll quote Amit Halevi on one more thing. He said, the problem begins with our concepts. And I said, well, which concept? And he said, well, first, the concept of human beings. He attributed this to Marxism. I corrected him that this is also a liberal prejudice. He said, we Westerners think of human being as economic, social, self-interested units, individuals. And so we end up with a head of the army intelligence like Tamir Heyman saying, no, I don't need the intelligence because I can calculate the interests of Hamas, and their interest is to put food on the table for their children. And so we don't have a category for a serious religious belief and serious ideological commitment. We imagine them like Obama does, that everyone is the same and everyone just wants peace and their children to come home safely. No, when a Palestinian mother is celebrating the death of her son as a shaheed, it's not fake. It's not always fake, because they are brought up on this.
I see why he thought of it as Marxism, and I think there's something to it in that. I'm not disagreeing with you that it's also Western liberalism, but there's a notion that's really prevalent in the security. Actually, I would just say in the elite, particularly the Democratic elite, but all the entire elite, especially since the end of the Cold War, that if we just set the right general conditions, if we manage the system correctly, we'll get the outcome we want. Because that was the whole idea really behind the Iran nuclear deal. We bring the Iranians into mutual dependencies with us, or into dependencies with us economically, and what happens is we don't think like Obama would say, we're going to change the calculus of Khamenei. He's going to, in his heart of hearts, he's still going to be hostile to us, but he's going to have things to lose if he's too hostile. This, of course, was also Amos Yadlin talking about the maritime border agreement between Lebanon and Israel, because there was now an economic dependency, and of course we knew that was going to moderate Hezbollah, because it didn't want to lose all of that international investment.
Amos Yadlin is also a former head of Army Intelligence, which in Israel is also the director of national intelligence. And Amos Yadlin is also on the payroll of the American administration, right, of the Democratic Party, as part of, he used to head the INSS think tank that is supported by the donors of the Democratic Party, and he's been trumpeting the the American line, and also he's laughed at often an Israeli on the right by Israeli right-wing feed denizens for never have made a right prediction in his whole life. Now, if I may, if I may use this as a springboard to another comment about the hostage deal and the fact that the anti-Netanyahu crowd has shifted its rhetoric to preventing a regional war. This is now their agenda. On the margin of that, there were a few instances, in a way funny or tragic in this week, when some of the people were put on spot by interviewers, asking these anti-Netanyahu crowds who've been saying hostages from the beginning, saying, well, would you support a hostage deal if the price is Netanyahu staying in power? And then you should see their faces contort. One was Abi Binyamin, a radical anti-Netanyahu person. He just laughed. He was embarrassed. He just laughed. And he said, well, that's a complicated question. And he said, what you meant? You said hostages at any price. What's complicated? And the interview in that case asked him, would you leave Netanyahu in power for 5 years? He couldn't say that he would. And the same thing happened to...
well, give him points for honesty.
Yeah. So, and Yasmin Friedman from Yesh Atid, the party that Yair Lapid governs undemocratically with an iron hand, also squirmed in an interview on the Knesset channel when she was asked, would Lapid go into a Netanyahu government in order to secure the return of the hostages? Actually, Lapid once said he would, but she couldn't say that. She said, I trust the head of my party blindly. I just wanted to say, well, of course, you can't trust him if you open your eyes even for 1 minute. But I just listened to that. The next day, Mike, I was in a studio on Channel 14, and she came there for an interview. And I couldn't resist the temptation. And because she was sitting on the other end of the panel, and then we were discussing Kamala Harris. And the anchor, Sharon Gal, turned to me and asked about Kamala Harris. And I said, can you imagine that Kamala Harris is like, she's even more vacuous than Yair Lapid. Can you imagine that? And I saw that one at the other end of the panel change colors. We went on to another subject, and Sharon very wisely and tactfully took us all out of the studio when he interviewed her one-on-one. I think, Mike, we're about to run out of time, so we have on our agenda today your special pet project of answering some of the questions by
we should talk a little bit about I didn't do my homework this time. I had the questions.
We didn't go. I promised that we would go back to our predictions.
Let's spend a couple of minutes on our predictions, and then I'll have to delay answers to burning questions until next week.
Okay. So
I apologize to those of you who have burning questions.
There were a few, and I'll save them for you. But
I do want to say that I can't answer the questions that are coming in about people's personal lives. We're getting questions about how to deal with girlfriends and husbands and so on.
So direct these questions to me. I'm very good at it, as is well known.
All your vexing personal questions, send them to Gadi.
So now, drum roll. You had an amazing prediction last week. What was it?
I predicted that there would be a war, or there would be a serious reprisal, and I thought it would be from both Iran and Hezbollah. I thought that both of them were under pressure to demonstrate that they could stand up to Israel, and I said that there was going to be an effort. I noted the fact that in pure military terms they don't really want to do it. But I thought that for political military reasons, they had to do it after Israel took out Haniya in Tehran and Shukr in Beirut. And I thought they were afraid of escalation with Israel.
Israel allegedly took Haniya out in.
They blamed Israel for that and are going to hold Israel responsible, regardless of whether Israel did it or not. So anyway, I thought they would square the circle between their desire to keep things at a kind of low burn, the way they are now, and their desire to avenge these killings by attacking only a military targets. And I thought they would try to make it look more dramatic by working together simultaneously against the same target. As it turns out, neither one of them is attacked. Iran has pretty much signaled publicly now that it will not attack, but it has apparently given permission, a green light to Hezbollah to do as Hezbollah sees fit. And all the Israelis and the Americans are saying they still expect for Hezbollah to take some action at some point in time, but the sense that it's about to happen today or tomorrow has dissipated. So basically, Gadi, I got it wrong. I got it wrong.
And power to you for being honest, Mike. I was slightly less wrong, although on these matters I am wrong more often than you are. And I said, I quote, I looked it up. I don't think it will escalate in one big bang. Escalation can creep in. So I'm supposed to be happy, I guess, at this segment. I was right, and there is no regional war. But I have to tell you, I wish you were right in at least one sense. We cannot let this opportunity go. And what I say to my Israeli friend, if Iran wants to avert a regional war, then it is in their interest and therefore not in ours. We need to take out the head of the snake at one point or other. We need to break the noose, the so-called ring of fire that Iran has created around us. We need to take out Hezbollah perched on our northern border. We need to repopulate the western Negev and the north of the country. And we need to do all this before Iran can create an effective nuclear umbrella above all its proxy forces. So nobody is trigger happy here. Nobody wants a war. As you said, Mike, repeatedly, this is bound to be a war with a price that Israel has never paid, including perhaps not in the War of Independence. The civilian casualties can be enormous and like nothing else we have ever experienced. But what is on the line now is the very existence of the state of Israel. And if Iran's drive to hegemony is not broken, then we will live in a region dominated by Nazis who are bent on the genocide of the Jewish people. So I can't say that at the end of this segment I'm happy with the results.
I have a rather different view. We'll have to discuss it at some point, but it will require a longer discussion. But I think right now we should all be happy. There's no major war. There's a problem up there in the north, exactly as you say. But this is.
Do you think we can avert war with Hezbollah in the long run?
Well, let's at some other point you and I have a long discussion about it. I think maybe I'll write something about it too. It's from my point of view a multi-layered argument. And if I can say it in one sentence, Hezbollah has a lot of capabilities that are going to be very, very difficult, I think impossible to suppress. So that has to be taken into account.
Yeah.
And the Americans. I'm a Ben Gurionist. What is it? How do you say it? What's the proper
Ben-Gurionist?
Yeah. A Ben-Gurionist. And you can't get into a war without great power support. It doesn't work.
We'll have an argument about that. I don't categorically disagree, but I think that there are shades in this spectrum. It's not an on-off or either-or question.
Right.
So now, after dropping the heaviest bomb in this conversation at the very end, let's shift sharply to a very humorous tweet, Mike, that you found. So here is your dumbest take on the news for this week.
My dumbest take is Barak Ravid And why don't you remind everyone who Barak Ravid is, because everybody is on this who's listening to this. Not everyone listening to this is paying as close attention to him as we are, I think.
Barak Ravid is considered by many to be a journalist. In my opinion, wrongly. He is almost a PR person for the Biden administration, even more vulgarly than Tom Friedman is. So whenever they just want their point of view trumpeted without reservation, without modification, they have Barak Ravid on. And now Barak Ravid was recruited to defend the choice of Ilan Goldenberg. Well, you remember I referred to this in the beginning of this show. So explain, Mike, what we are.
So Ilan Goldenberg, you will recall that last week I published an article in Tablet magazine about the anti-Israel sanctions machine that the Biden administration has set up. And in that article, I mentioned that Ilan Goldenberg, I mentioned two things. One, that he's an aide to Kamala Harris. He was on her team, and now he's moved to a different office in the National Security Council. But he will certainly play a significant role in her administration if she is elected. And he has been appointed by her as the liaison to the American Jewish community. That happened actually the very day my article came out. And the article said that he played an enthusiastic role from the White House in supporting and working on this anti-Israel sanctions machine. Now, once he was appointed liaison to the Jewish community, there was a lot of criticism of him that came out immediately from pro-Israel circles, and they pointed out not just his role on this sanctions machine now, but also his past support for rapprochement with Iran. And so Barak Ravid came to his defense. I mean, Barak Ravid is supposed to be a reporter. Instead of being a reporter, he's now become a defender of Ilan Goldenberg. And so he put out a tweet saying several points from the facts department. Number one, Kamala Harris is a Democrat and therefore appoints a Democrat for her campaign's Jewish community liaison. In other words, saying, you Israelis are pro-Israel, he's really talking to fellow Israelis, saying, you Israelis who are attacking Kamala Harris, well, what do you think she's going to appoint? A right-wing Republican? She appointed a Democrat, and he has 5 other points about what a wonderful guy Ilan Goldenberg is. For example, Ilan isn't for diplomacy at any cost with Iran. Notice how he uses his first name. Ilan isn't for diplomacy at any cost with Iran and isn't against the U.S. using military power in the Middle East to deter Iran and its proxies. So he's a good Goldenberg is a good anti-Iran guy. Another point, I have known Ilan Goldenberg for more than a decade. He is pro-Israel with mainstream Democrat positions on Israel-Palestine. I just want to point out one thing about this, the personal familiarity, because one of the ways that the anti-Israel sanctions machine works is that it creates it's really an information operation more than anything else. The whole goal is to create a sense that the Netanyahu government is extreme and to keep a climate of controversy around it. So some of the work that this machine has done, this is an interagency team that finds targets in Israel for sanctions and then proposes them to the senior leadership for approval. One of the things that it's done is it created lots of headlines about possibly sanctioning individuals, but then not sanctioning them, including Ben Gvir. But if you go back and you check the record, you will find who is the outlet in the media who breaks these scoops that Ben Gvir or Netzach Yehuda are about to be sanctioned, or there's a debate inside the administration about sanctioning them?
Barak Ravid.
Barak Ravid. So there's Barak Ravid taking care of his source. So now we know who's going to Barak Ravid and telling Barak Ravid that Ben Gvir is about to be his good old friend Ilan Goldenberg. So they're taking care of each other.
I want to interject with one important point about Barak Ravid. He blocked me on Twitter. And
Guess what?
he blocked you too.
No, Elon Goldenberg did.
So that's exactly well, they're both Israelis. So I was going to make a point that this is an internal domestic affair in Israel as well as America, but that's not true. So my dumbest take.
Sorry, one last thing. Barak Ravid, yeah. I traded tweets with him back over the maritime border dispute. And but in Hebrew I did, and he wrote back and really testily and said, Mike, because he was saying the point then was that the maritime border agreement saved lives, right? De-escalation, right? Yeah. Creating mutual dependencies between Hezbollah and Israel. We're practically on the way to Abraham Accords with Hezbollah, right? And I said, and I wrote a tweet saying, no, actually, you're undermining Israeli deterrence. And he wrote back and said, Mike, if you're so hell bent on Israeli deterrence, then you should make Aliyah. It's who are you from afar to tell us what to do? So I said, I'm a goy. Goyim don't make Aliyah. But now I could write back to Barak Ravid and say, get out of our politics, Barak.
And go back home.
Go back home.
So my dumbest take on the news is a press release by the Attorney General in Israel. Actually, it's the state attorney, not the Attorney General, that they are going to prosecute a very popular Mizrahi singer, the most popular Mizrahi singer, Eyal Golan, a huge star in Israel, for saying right after October 7th that we should raise Gaza to the ground. That's not the dumbest take yet. Everybody thought it was not just dumb, it's also unequal enforcement. How do you say? What's the English expression?
I don't know.
There
is a term.
Selective enforcement, because the president Bougie Herzog said something not unlike that, and
right.
And some judge of the Supreme Court said something not unlike that. And then there was a Yaron London who said something not unlike that. They are all, of course, Ashkenazim and from the left. So nobody is bothering them. But here's the dumbest take on the news, because once there was a public uproar against that, and then the defenders of the Israeli juristocracy said, you don't understand. They are defending Golan, the singer, from The Hague, because at The Hague they quoted him. And now there's a principle in international politics that if we prosecute him correctly, then Hague will leave him alone. The Hague, will leave him alone. And so they are basically defending them. And that, as I said here on television, that
it's so good. It's so good.
This is the worst of the diaspora mentality. Let's snitch on our own brothers in order to find favor with the goyim, and it never works. It will not work in The Hague, because of course this is not a procedure, a judicial procedure. This is a political anti-Semitic move. So what do you expect? But these people are taking it seriously, and as I said, this is why they also hound Israeli soldiers on their behavior in October 7 with such relish. They should have been, if someone committed a crime on October 7th, they should be investigated with kid gloves, given the situation that there was chaos and no army. And if you killed a prisoner in the midst of a battle, you can't, when people are being murdered in Be'eri kibbutz, then you captured one terrorist, you can't just stay there and guard him until the police come, can you? You're in the middle of chaos. So maybe you committed a crime, you shouldn't have shot him in the head or something, but there are circumstances to this, and they don't think of it this way. They think that if they persecute our soldiers with relish, then in this way they are serving as a shield from international courts of justice, which is of course foolish.
I remember broke my heart. I was listening to a mother who survived. She was either from Kfar Aza or Nahal Oz, one of these places on the Gaza periphery that was attacked brutally on October 7th. She survived. She hid with her daughter somewhere in the house. I can't remember, but she had to be very quiet so that the terrorists wouldn't hear them. And she whispered to her daughter that, don't worry, we're one of the good Jews, like we're against Netanyahu. We're in favor of rapprochement with them, so we're going to be okay. And it's of course that it would have no influence on the terrorists.
Yeah, it's both heartbreaking and despairing. Some people just don't get it. They don't understand.
I'm sure that the people in the Gaza periphery have a new attitude now.
Some, but some, as we know, aren't. Well, that's it from us for this week. Please do not forget to subscribe to one of our channels wherever it is that you are receiving our show. Please subscribe, and we will see you next Tuesday here, same place, same time.